Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in today's video we are going to talk about becoming a better raider, specifically on predictability. Predictability is, I think, a way that you can think about raiding, especially progression raiding, although this will also apply to Mythic Plus. This is mostly going to be aimed at more competitive players, but hopefully there's something in here for everybody, regardless of how much, say, preparation you're interested in doing in raid. There should hopefully be something in here that helps you improve as well. So what do I mean by predictability? Basically, my core premise is that when you're doing progression raiding, especially mythic progression raiding, but also when you're doing a dungeon push with a set group, one of the big things that gives you value and that helps you overcome encounters is that you and your team start to develop an ability to expect each other's moves because you do something similar from pull to pull. And a lot of this can be done sort of automatically, but if you actually think about it actively, it can be something that you can accelerate that process and you can make smart active decisions instead of just whatever sort of you default into by passively doing whatever's happening. So we can give some examples for this, but I guess the first thing to think about is like when you're just starting progression on a fight, the first few pulls. So here is a progression graph for Rashok, for instance, and pulls 1 through 10, of this fight, for instance, for my guild, mostly is a spot where you're sort of learning the mechanics. You're learning, oh, that kills me. You're learning your cooldown timings. This is something that can be mitigated with prep, right? You can prep cooldown timings, but that's not especially fun for a lot of players. A lot of players like to learn their cooldown timings by experimentation and by doing, and I'm not trying to make this video about doing more prep or anything like that, because that's almost always something you can get some value out of. There's a lot of good ways that you can look at Warcraft logs and come to fights more prepared, but that also for a lot of players diminishes their fun of those encounters, and I want to make this video mostly about the stuff that isn't related to that. But either way, whether you have prepped your cooldown timings or you're kind of learning them, right? You're kind of learning like, oh, Rashok is going to do this slam here, so I'm going to need to move for 3 globals here, so I need to turn around my cooldowns a little bit here, and then, but I need to make sure, because I know this fight lasts however long, right? I need to make sure that I am pressing it by this time so that I get a full use at the end of the fight or something like that, right? Like you're kind of learning and internalizing these things about your cooldowns, and that's what the first few pulls are for. Pretty early on, you want to stop being somebody who will wipe the raid if they're targeted by a mechanic, right? Very early on in progression, it's okay to experiment and to be like, oh, what happens if I use Ice Block against this mechanic? And sometimes the answer is going to be, that doesn't work, you wipe the raid, right? Rashok doesn't really have a good example of this, but there are mechanics like that, where it's like, oh, Sarkareth's mythic holes, right? What happens if I alter time, run through, and then can I alter back up? The answer to that one, I think, is yes. But that's not something you want to test, except for during wipes. So once a wipe is called is a really good time to check how a certain interaction will work out, right? To see like, hey, what happens if I do this? That's a good way to do that. But otherwise, your general progression mode should be, let's not be the person that causes this pull to go from a live pull to a wipe, right? Let's try not to be that person, if at all possible. So predictability. What does that mean? Well, so you've got your own predictability with your cooldowns, but there's also boss mechanics that come into play. Rashok is a reasonably good example of this because it has the Doom Flames mechanic, for instance, where the boss will based on where the boss is, create a bunch of Doom Flames that start falling on the ground in different spots, right? Like here, or whatever. You've got a bunch of Doom Flames to pick up. I don't know if I can do world markers. No, I can't because I'm not in a raid group. But you've got some Doom Flames that are coming down, and you need to pick up you need to have them all get soaked, right? And there's a few different ways that predictability matters for this. First of all, the tank players should ideally have the boss in a predictable position for this mechanic and for other mechanics like this. Predictability is extremely important for the tanks. If the boss is always in the same spot here, you're going to have a much better time because everybody else will be able to do something predictable and be in the same spot every time. So with Doom Flames, it's a good example. If Rashok's up against a wall, you're going to be spawning Doom Flames in a nice little arc around him. And it can be very easy to see. If Rashok is sometimes near the middle of the room, sometimes near the wall, it's a lot worse, and you'll have Doom Flames in unexpected locations. Within that as well, though, you can, as an individual player on that mechanic, start to develop an idea of, am I trying to soak Doom Flames during this set? And which Doom Flames am I trying to soak during this set? So, for instance, during Rashok, I was the off tank. The other tank was bubble taunting. So I was always going and getting a far Doom Flames away from the range stack. I would try and see the farthest one, instantly roll over and claim it, and be soaking that. And that was something I would do every single Doom Flames cast of every single pull. And people would learn to react to that, right? The ranged players, like the hunter that was running out and trying to soak, would know, okay, one of them over there is going to get soaked, so maybe I'll go take this one, something like that. The melee players under boss would know, all right, I can get the melee ones, I can get the ones over towards this side, right? But I don't want to go over here. And eventually you sort of develop this way of playing that becomes consistent, where by doing something like that every time, even if it doesn't really matter which thing you're doing, by doing the same thing every time, the rest of your raid can start also doing the same thing every time. And you want to ideally make that an optimal thing. So for instance, whether or not you should soak Doom Flames if you're, say, an Arcane Mage is going to depend on if you're in your Surge, if you're in your Rune of Power, or if you're just vibing, right? If you're just vibing, if you're out of your cooldowns, that would maybe be a good Doom Flame set to go and try and soak on, right? And so you could soak during that one every time, the ones that come up outside of your cooldowns. And then the ones when you're in your cooldowns, if you're in a high-end progression guild where you can trust your other 19 players, that is a great case for you to be like, yeah, you know what? I'm in my Rune of Power. Somebody else will handle this one, right? And you can start to reliably just always be in your Rune of Power. And people, sometimes you'll have this thing where people will go and try and save the pull or something. And that is something where, especially in really, as you start trying to get into high-end play, you want to ideally be playing with people and give them the trust that they will solve the mechanics when it's correct for you to be planted in your cooldowns. In lower-end guilds, this can be the opposite. In lower-end guilds, you might not have 19 players you can trust to have your back on a mechanic like that, and you might not have somebody that you can trust to go and see the Doom Flames off over in the corner. And so your best bet for killing that boss, you might not be... Your guild's not going to kill that boss at 432 item level, right? You're going to kill it at 442 item level. You're going to have some damage to give, and the answer is going to be give some damage and go and soak the far Doom Flames in your cooldowns. But in a high-end setting, you do want to be able to kind of identify, should I be somebody handling this mechanic? And if the answer is yes, then aggressively and predictably solve that mechanic. If the answer is no, then ideally you want to give the other players who are the right people to be solving that mechanic, here's a hint, they're often going to be the healers, the opportunity to go and do that for you, so that you can keep doing what you're there for, which is damage in some cases. So I don't want to give a blanket ruling for this one, because it does depend on the context, but it is something to be aware of, is like, am I the right person to do this job? And then even if I'm not the right person to do this job, if I don't do it, is somebody else actually going to do it? Because if not, then I should do it anyways, right? I should just bite the bullet and actually handle this mechanic. And over time, by doing this, by not just with mechanics, but by positioning in a predictable place, there should be some thought about where you are standing in a boss room, right? If you're a ranged DPS player, there is a reason to be somewhere in the room, right? There is the next time you're going to have to be somewhere. So by default, a lot of ranged players are just planting, and then they get these globals in the rotation, right? You've got your instant cast Living Flames if you're a Devastation Evoker, that let you move. And you should have somewhere that is the best place in the room for you to be, and a degree of how urgent it is for you to get there, right? And even if it's pretty low urgency, you should be thinking about, where in the room do I actually want to be? And then move there on your movement globals. Move there if you're the tank controlling the boss. You actually also want to always be like, where should the boss be? How do I want this boss to be moving? And ideally, can it be doing this exact same movement every single pull so that everybody else can plan around this? But if you're a ranged DPS, you also want to have an idea of where you should be. So for Rashok, a good example of this is, even when nothing's going on, you want to be somewhere in the room that makes it so that you can get to the slam position if you're targeted quickly enough, right? You don't want to be planting yourself in a spot in the room where if you're targeted by the slam, it's going to be bad, right? So a reasonably high priority is always being close enough that you can get to the orb that you need to break with the slam depending on what class you're playing, you have a movement ability that will do this for you. But if you're playing something like a priest, you might not, and it might actually be important for you to always make sure that you're kind of adjusting a little bit towards the boss, towards the edge of the room, so that if you're targeted, you can do that. The next thing on that fight is, Doomflame soaks, making sure that if you're going to be soaking, you're kind of in a good position to be able to do so without losing much damage. But also the charge smash, right? The ability that the entire raid has to soak. The next mechanic that might matter for your positioning might well be soaking that. So if you are 30 yards away from the boss and you're on a movement global, right? You're on an instant cast Living Flame. That's a great time to just, during that global, be moving towards where you're next going to need to be. And again, ideally over the course of pull to pull, you can start being in the same place every time so that it becomes very predictable to you what might happen to you in any given spot. A good thing to think about to short circuit some progression time is, what if I was the person targeted by this mechanic, right? Like, you see a smash coming out and it's not on you and you're like, oh, well, if that had been on me, actually, that would have been bad, right? And you can learn from other people's mechanics, not just from your mechanics. That's something that is a very valuable skill to develop for progression rating, is thinking about what might happen to you rather than just learning when it does happen to you. Because, you got 20 people in the raid, right? If all 20 people have to get targeted by a mechanic before they learn it, that's a lot of extra pulls, right? That's a lot of extra progression that you're going to need to do, versus if you can learn from stuff without having it actually immediately happen to you. Some cases, it's like you do these pulls where it's like, oh yeah, I got targeted by 20 of the 25 mechanics that could have targeted me. I got overloaded. It got me. Like, maybe in theory there was a way I could have lived it, but it wasn't actually going to happen. I'm not saying you can beat that situation, but I am saying you should at least have a plan for what happens if I'm targeted by this mechanic. And that plan, if you think about it, one thing that a lot of players won't do is have a plan to call an external, or have a plan to call like a movement ability, right? Calling a life grip or a rescue. Those abilities are so often not used in progression rating, especially in lower end cutting edge guilds. I look at logs and these buttons are just never getting pressed. And it's hard on the fly, right? You get targeted by a mechanic and your hover's on cooldown if you're an evoker or whatever, and you're like, and then you just start running, and then the slam lands in a bad space, and you're like, damn it, right? But you've got another evoker in your raid who's rescues off CD, or you've got rescue off CD, and you could rescue some unwitting person. It's a little bit sketch, but, calling for some other evoker to rescue, calling for yourself to get life gripped back in, right? Being like, oh, can you grip me after this? That's something where having that kind of, thinking ahead and having a plan about that ability for what you're going to do if you're targeted can help us get over this block we have about calling externals and about having other people help us. Because often, even just saying, oh, I need some help with this, right? Anything like that, if you say that in voice comms, the other 19 people in your raid that weren't thinking about how to help you get your slam into the right spot or survive a mechanic will now be thinking about it, right? The healers will now look at you. They'll look at your health bar if you have a couple stacks of a dot and you don't have a defensive or something like that you normally have a defensive for. If you call out that you're going to need some help, it's better to call something like a specific external if you know which ones are available and unused. Getting a way to track those cooldowns of those externals is a really good answer. But even just a general kind of like offloading it from being something that only you're thinking about to being a problem that the raid is going to solve. Again, if you've got 19 people that you can trust to solve those problems, that can be really good. Looking for those things in others as well. One thing I do on Rashok is I call for people to get life gripped. If a healer's getting targeted and they're going really far, I'll be like, hey, can we just grip this person after this is done? Those sorts of things are ways that you can make these mechanics less punishing when they do happen to target an unlucky person, a person that, isn't the mage that can just alter back to wherever they were. So that's just some thoughts on predictability, on rating, mostly on rating. I do want to say for Mythic Plus as well, there's some value to this as well. One thing that's really valuable in Mythic Plus is predictably interacting with the same pack the same way. So something like, I'm always going to kick triangle, I'm always going to, leg sweep this cast or something like that. I'm always going to Ring of Peace this mob here. I'm doing this thing. Doing that every time is something that will make it so if you're ever pushing keys with a consistent group, that's really good. And ideally, you kind of want to even learn like a heuristic in your head that makes it so you can predict what your group mates are going to do, right? It's really valuable. I've played with some players that always follow a coherent logic of their abilities, right? Like some demon hunters are always like, okay, I'm gonna kick the most important cast in this ability in this pack, and I'm gonna kick it instantly. Like I'm gonna kick the first important cast in this pack or something like that, or I'm gonna kick purple, but I'm always kicking purple fast because I want my fury, right? And then when I see that mob starting to cast, or when I see that mob get marked with purple, something like that, I know what's going to happen, and I can play accordingly. I'm not going to overlap my kick. I'm not going to be looking at that mob, and I can be looking at the other mobs that need help. And then I can, if somebody needs help on something, of course, it's very important to call it as well. Whenever there's something that you have been doing for 10 dungeon runs, or especially in Raid, if there's something you have been doing, even if you've not really talked about it, let's say it's Scale Commander Sarkareth, right? And the first set of ad spawn, and you've just always been hitting them with a leg sweep, right? The first set of ad spawn in P2, and you've been hitting them with a leg sweep on their first cast. 19 players in the raid are expecting you to hit those mobs with a leg sweep, right? That is something where if you ever don't have leg sweep there, if you ever are doing a mechanic somewhere else, or for whatever reason, you pressed leg sweep early and it was before the mob spawned, or you pressed leg sweep but they got knocked out of the way at some point, and your leg sweep is not where people are expecting it to be, you need to call that out, because predictability is going to work against you in that spot. That's a spot where your whole raid has been conditioned, right? You've conditioned them to expect something, and now it's not going to happen. This is why, if you're a raid leader, you need to be really cautious with mechanics that you call 50% of the time. If you call a mechanic 100% of the time, people will do it. If you call a mechanic 0% of the time, maybe it's a problem mechanic, but people will learn to do it, right? But if you call a mechanic even 50%, they'll probably know to do it. But if you call a mechanic 90% of the time, the 10% of the time that you don't call it is going to be really, really sketch. So it's very important that you look at these things and you make sure that you haven't lulled everybody into a false sense of security, and you're not going to wipe the raid off of something unsaid because people are expecting something to either be said or done. That is the downside of predictability, but it's worth it. You get so much free brain power off of being predictable that it is worth it to let yourself be lulled into those false senses of security and to trust people to call out if you need to fix that. And then just, that's something you got to talk to. You got to be like, look, if you can't get that sweep there, you got to say something, right? Or if it's a case of like, oh, actually my leg sweep shouldn't be assigned for this because 10% of the time I'm targeted by this mechanic, we should assign this instead to it because that person never can get targeted by that or something. There should be a capacitor totem because they can do that even at range, right? Something like that. Those are discussions worth having, but you have to actually have those discussions, or else call out in the middle of the pull if there's going to be a deviation from what you're used to seeing. That is how you take a boss from a high pull count to a low pull count, is because you really early on are doing the same thing every single time, and then you are getting the ability to you get free learning, right? You kind of get this hive mind value out of your whole raid, all being, some of the thought that you have to do is offloaded onto other people that are being predictable with what they're doing, and you can just rely on that, and you can rely on them solving the problem, and you can rely on them saying something if what they have usually done isn't going to work. That is my video for today. Hope there was something in here that was somewhat useful. Hope that this didn't just come across as random rambling. I've tried to make it somewhat cohesive, but that's always a challenge for me in these videos. Do let me know if you're interested in more stuff like this. I have a couple more ideas for videos on becoming a better raider, better Mythic Pluser. So if you liked this one, those could well be in future videos as well. Thanks for watching. Remember to hit subscribe and stuff. See you in the next one. Bye.